Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 to 8. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. To know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching.
So, it really is great to have you join us. I'm one of the leaders here at MCC. This morning, we're going to be doing part 2 of this 5 to 6 part series that we're undertaking this year on the Old Testament book of Proverbs. And this morning, we're just going to be covering the first 7 verses of the book. And this, if you like, is the prologue. It's the big purpose statement of the book of Proverbs. And I think a good kind of definition is that it's if you like, it's trying to make a case for extreme wisdomship, all the benefits that are contained in the Old Testament notion of wisdom. But before we get into it, I just want to, again, try to point out, make a case, if you like, for how much of an appetite I think there is out there for wisdom in the modern world, for true wisdom, not just fake wisdom, but true wisdom. In the book of Proverbs, you'll see, we read before, that this wisdom is first attributed to King Solomon, who we talked a lot about last week. King of Israel, for a while, the wisest person in the world. And in verse 8 of chapter 1, we see who the primary audience, the original primary audience of this book of Proverbs was. So who is this originally addressed to? And it reads, "Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching." So Proverbs, we think, was originally, not exclusively, but originally and primarily addressed to young men, unmarried young men. Probably many of them from well-to-do backgrounds. So princes almost, literally perhaps, sons of Solomon. So they came from well-to-do backgrounds, again, privilege, all that kind of stuff, with the world at their feet. With the world at their feet. If they were royalty, they would have had the world at their feet. But critically, they were desperately in need of true wisdom. Young people with the world at their feet, desperately in need of true wisdom. And I'd argue that really not that much has changed. The evidence, and at least some evidence, and I came across this just this last week. The evidence, I think, the data plus subjective experience seems to be demonstrating that the popular mainstream versions of what passes as wisdom with a small w in our current Western world are not working. It's just not working. So this little snippet came from The Atlantic magazine. So again, not a religious, Christian, spiritual journal whatsoever, but a regular mainstream publication, well respected. And they said, the 2023, so recent World Happiness Report, a comprehensive survey spanning over 140 countries, so big study, reveals a puzzling discrepancy in youth happiness trends around the world. So get this, while young people in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Western Europe have indeed experienced significant decline in happiness between 2006 and 2023, their counterparts, so young people in other regions, so not America, England, Australia, New Zealand, tell a starkly different story. Surprisingly, happiness among those under 30, that's young people, under 30 has actually increased in many parts of the world during the same period. Central and Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union and East Asia have all seen substantial improvements in youth well-being. This geographical divide in happiness trends presents a challenge to the simplistic narrative that smartphones and social media are the primary culprits behind the youth mental health crisis. So maybe it's not all smartphones and social media. You're welcome, kids. So If it's not smartphones and social media that are making young people unhappier in the West, what may it be? And here are 5 out of the original 7 suggested culprits. And again, these came from a mainstream, regular magazine. The pressure of individualism. Again, there's just so much pressure on me to define myself, work out who I am. What's my identity? Number 2, economic inequality has gone like through the roof in Western countries over the last 10, 15 years. Thirdly, the paradox of choice, which we've talked about before. All these different options, again, the world at my feet, all these resources, all these benefits that my forebears didn't have. All these options can lead to overwhelm and paralysis. All this choice, despite all the Disney movies you've seen, may not be a good thing. Fourthly, erosion of community. All those social bonds that, again, our prior generations have just taken for granted and they've lent on. And number 5, the tyranny of perfectionism. So here's where social media and Western ideals of success, you've got to look this way, you've got to have these experience, combine and mutate and get really, really dangerous. So again, whatever is being peddled as mainstream, regular, typical wisdom here in the West, it doesn't appear to be working. Whereas if I was a betting man, or even a guy who believed in raffling, I would suggest that spending a year thoroughly studying the book of Proverbs, just going through the book of Proverbs alone, will go a long way in inoculating people against those risks. Does that make sense? Okay, good. So there is still a strong case to be made for the benefits of the wisdom with a capital W that we find in Proverbs. And that's what I want to spend the rest of our time this morning doing. Let's get back in sync. Okay, yeah, okay. So, firstly, look at the shape of these 7 verses. So, if you've got your Bibles, please crack them open. We're looking at, again, the first 7 verses of Proverbs chapter 1. Out of 6 verses, so from verse 2 to verse 7, 4 of them lead with 2 or 4, depending upon your translation. Hard to explain, easier to kind of look at. So verse 1, as you'll see, starts off with, again, the Proverbs of Solomon. And almost all of verses 2 to 6 explain what the purpose of these Proverbs are, what the collection is for, verses 2 to 6. So look at this. To provide this, or for this, again, depending upon the translation. See that? And it's all, as you'll see up there, verses 2 to 6, it's all almost one long, seemingly really messy sentence. It's all one big sentence in the English. So what are the authors trying to do here? They are piling on all these benefits and positive outcomes that come with the book of Proverbs. They're trying to almost overwhelm the reader, if you like. They're trying to overwhelm the reader with how good it all is. If you study and meditate, wrestle, chew on the collection of Proverbs that you'll find here, you are going to be prone to being the beneficiary of all these great benefits. And it's hard for us in the English because a bunch of these benefits seem similar and they will overlap, but they're also critically different from each other. Because this version of wisdom with a capital W, it's multi-orbed, it's rich, it's comprehensive, it's got layers, which is why I want to go through these benefits one by one. So to know wisdom, or for gaining wisdom in verse 1. Wisdom in the Hebrew, chokmah, is probably the most common term for any of the benefits in the book of Proverbs. And like we talked about a little last week, this isn't just intellectual or theoretical wisdom, though there are certainly those elements to it. It's about how the best way, wisdom is the best way to cope and deal with life in all its messiness. So it's practical. And if you look there in verse 2, we're told that studying or meditating on Proverbs will lead to us knowing wisdom, to knowing wisdom. And in ancient Israel, to know someone or something frequently meant more than just a intellectual, shallow kind of knowing or knowledge or understanding. To know something or someone often, again in Israel, implied having some kind of relationship with the object or the person that you're knowing. So I can't just know wisdom at arm's length. I need to have almost some level of intimacy with wisdom. I have to be familiar with wisdom. It's more than just book wisdom, if you like. This is C.S. Lewis on the left and a guy called Walter Hooper on the right. Walter Hooper was a young American man who first read C.S. Lewis as a student. Then, while serving some time in the military, he read a couple of C.S. Lewis's books and became a fervent C.S. Lewis fanboy. He wrote to C.S. Lewis, and he met him for the first time near the end of Lewis's life in England. So went from America to England. And after that first initial meeting and cups of tea, he became his personal assistant / secretary in literally the last year or two of Lewis's life. He cared for him and his affairs. And later, after C.S. Lewis passed, he cared for his brother, Warning, until his death. And later on in his life, Hooper wrote an excellent biography of Lewis. Now, how different do you think that biography would have been if Hooper had merely studied everything else that other people had written about C.S. Lewis? He said of Lewis, "Lewis was the most thoroughly converted man I ever met." Could he have said that about Lewis without that first-hand relational knowledge, without knowing Lewis? I don't think so. The impact Lewis had on Hooper wouldn't have been the same if it had just been a theoretical, I've read a bunch of books, I've listened to some of his podcasts kind of knowledge about Lewis. If it had been purely theoretical. That kind of knowing and being informed by and impacted by that relationship is the kind of knowledge that we need to have of wisdom. So that's wisdom. Verse 2 then moves on to say that Proverbs, this collection, are for instruction. This is another key term in the book, and it can also be sometimes translated as discipline. Now, what's really interesting about this term is that it's probably not so much about the kind of instruction received from a manual, again, a book. This is more about the kind of instruction that comes via an apprenticeship. So it carries the implications of things like correction, of discipline, of even adversity, and being shaped by someone in authority. Think God, think a parent, think a king or a teacher. So God, your mentors, your peers even, may take this collection of Proverbs and they may use them to help course correct you in life. This may be a costly process, but the result may be priceless. You see what I did there? Come on. Costly process, but the result may be priceless. Yeah. Look, I've read a bunch of self-help, businessy kind of books in my time, and they cost me like a little money, right? They cost me like a little money. I've had lots of good friends. I've been so blessed in having good friends, family, colleagues who have generally been really supporting and encouraging of me. And those friends really, and colleagues and family, they really haven't cost me anything. But in my life, I've only had, thus far, one Mr. P. Mr. P was my grade 11 and 12 humanities teacher. Now, I largely coasted my way through school until then. I'd gotten lots of attaboys, and I thought I was pretty smart, right? At the very least, I could usually make teachers like me or feel sorry for me, like a strange combination of the two. And then I meet Mr. P. The first couple of essays that I handed in to Mr. P, they were book review kind of things on classical Greek plays, Sophocles, I can't even pronounce, the Agamemnon, et cetera, et cetera. So I handed them back to Mr. P after I'd done them, and they came back with this just copious amounts of feedback in this beautifully handwritten red pen. But the feedback was far from beautiful. It was pointed, it was full of emotion, chiefly exasperation. It highlighted my ignorance, blind spots, and shortcomings. And it sure wasn't full of attaboys, you can do it, Matt, you're a gift. Had none of that. And worst of all, it was all true. He knew I was coasting, like he had my number. This same Mr. P, when I was repeatedly goofing off in class, again in grade 11 and 12, almost inexcusable, trying to make people laugh repeatedly, right? One day, he literally stopped lecture mid-sentence and yelled, "Bain," whilst throwing a blackboard eraser at me across the room. So this man, he called me out, and I'm not endorsing any of his teaching methods, but I can't comment on that because I'm not a teacher. But he called me out, he embarrassed me, he made me feel guilty, he made me question my ability and my motives. But I tell you that was over half a lifetime ago for me now. And seriously, I've since tried to bring all my limited brain power to every big and complicated book I've had to read since. And I'm not a star student by any means, but I don't coast. And when someone is trying to impart or teach me something, I don't goof around anymore. I take their time seriously. Mr. P was my instruction, my discipline. He helped shape me and remains one of, if not my favourite teacher. He was also the first person to introduce me to Bob Dylan. You've all got your own kind of versions of that, I'm sure, like a similar story. And my point is that is what Proverbs can help do. Provide that hard but oh so valuable instruction. Next we read that Proverbs will help the reader understand. Also translated discern. So understand, discern, the sayings of the wise or the words of insight. This is probably more heady and intellectual than the relational knowing that we talked about. And this may be a reference to what we read of in verse 6. So if you look down at verse 6, we read of the sayings of the wise, the words of insight, the proverbs, parables, and riddles. In other words, meditating, studying, again, wrestling, wrangling with this current collection of proverbs may help us further understand and appreciate current and future proverbs, parables that cross our paths, that contain God's truth from different sources. So studying these parables helps broaden our general capacity to take in and appreciate wisdom from various sources going ahead. That's what I think that means. Verse 3 says that, again, more and more benefits. Proverbs are useful for taking in discipline/instruction, so I've already talked about that, for wise or prudent living. What is wise or prudent living? Well, get this. It is about, one commentator said, intelligently assessing a real-world situation and coming, critically, to a practical decisions. Wow. Proverbs will help you taking in, receiving the instruction, the discipline, to be a person who can make practical decisions in the trenches of everyday regular life. Wow. Again, instead of Proverbs merely belonging in the realm of kind of stereotypically super spiritual, detached, pure kind of like knowledge, instead of that, Proverbs is all about the messiness of life. In other words, Proverbs will help you be the last one kicked off the desert island, okay? Because this is the kind of person, the Proverbs person is the kind of person you want in the crisis when you find yourself marooned on the island with company. So the professional social influencer will probably be the first one gone. Next will be any kind of professional or consultant who calls themselves a thought leader. But the person who can make practical decisions in real-life complex scenarios or crisis, those guys, and probably the plumbers, they'll be the last ones to go, okay? They'll be the last ones to go. But really importantly, this superpower talent can be used for good or bad, right? It's kind of amoral in that regard. It needs some moral guardrails. Hence, the next part of verse 3. So we read of righteousness, justice, and equity. Again, big buzzwords, so let's try to unpack them briefly. Righteousness is all about establishing right order. Now that can still, at least to me, sound too nebulous. So let's think of two more specific guidelines. Right order, so righteousness, right order, will mirror and reflect God's character and preferred order, okay? And right order and righteousness will involve relationships. So relationships with God, our fellow humans, and the rest of creation. God is primarily concerned with rightly ordered relationships. Love the Lord, your God, with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So that's the relationship with God. And love your neighbour as yourself, the horizontal relationships. And just trying to live out these two things alone will lead to righteousness and right order. Justice. Justice is bound up with this. So justice, if righteousness is all about establishing right order, justice can be thought of restoring that right order when it's been broken or compromised. And equity, that third moral guideline, equity can be seen to be about both speaking what is right and making decisions that are fair and honest. Fair and honest. So Proverbs are for acting with practical wisdom in the real world in ways that are consistent with establishing righteous order, restoring it when it's broken, and speaking and rendering decisions that are honest and fair. So now you're on that desert island. You've got limited resources to make limited amounts of shelters. You happen to be middle-aged and in the prime of your life, and you've got some feeble and infirm folk over here, and you've got some injured folk over here, and you've got some really, really young kids over here. You don't know how long you're going to be marooned for. What do you do? Or to use a recent and true and historical example, the Nazis are knocking on every door in your village, asking if you or anyone you know are harbouring Jews. Big rewards if you give them up. Maybe a less stellar future ahead for you if you say, I don't know anything about that. There's the purely practical response, and then there are the practical responses that are made within the guardrails of righteousness, justice, and equity. People have had to make those decisions in history. Someone in the world is probably making them right now. Proverbs is for that very thing. Verse 4 says that Proverbs are for giving prudence or shrewdness to the naive and the simple. Now, this term of prudence or shrewdness, pretty interestingly, was applied to the serpent, the snake, in Genesis chapter 3. So sometimes this term gets a bad rap. But to me, and from what I've read, it can also be translated or seen as street smarts. Street smarts. So again, it can be used negatively, but in this context, it's a positive attribute. Studying these proverbs will make you shrewd and street smart. Shrewd and street smart. And in this regard, if you read it, if you're reading along, you'll see that this is particularly pertinent for, quote, the simple. The simple and naive need these smarts to negotiate life well. Now, the simple is a recurring character in the book of Proverbs, so it's kind of good to get a good little sketch as to who this person is. There's nothing sinful or wicked in being simple or naive. It means untaught. It means inexperienced, a greenhorn, if you like. But the critical point is you don't want to stay simple, and there's no excuse to be simple long term. Because if you're simple long term, if you choose to stay simple, then eventually you'll end up vulnerable to being preyed upon. You'll end up being manipulated. You'll end up being someone else's prey to be led astray. So in other words, you can start off simple, but that can soon turn sinful if you're exposed to the wrong influences. It's a bit like, you've heard that old adage, if you're at, say, a card game and you're trying to work out who the guy is who's being played, and you can't work out who the guy is who's being played, you're the guy who's being played. Yeah. So you don't want to be that simple, naive, inexperienced greenhorn who goes through life thinking that everything is just beer and Skittles and everyone is out to be your best friend and people are always trying their best and always doing the right thing. There's just no excuse for that. Proverbs help protect you. And really importantly, the simple and naive are different from some other leading characters in Proverbs, namely the fool and the scoffer. Why are they different from the fool and the scoffer? Fools and scoffers can't be taught. They cannot be taught. They refuse to learn. They won't take the posture of humility that learning requires, which usually means that eventually, not always, but usually, they will suffer. And this relates to the next thing Proverbs provides, again in verse 4, knowledge and discretion. So, in other words, the ability to dodge the pitfalls of evil, that life will just undoubtedly present you. Also here in verse 4, we find out more about the original audience. It's the young. It says there in verse 4 that the original audience was the young. So anyone of the older crowd can just nod approvingly and think, yeah, Proverbs is the basic wisdom for the young people. You do your time for Proverbs, and then you graduate into the real kind of sophisticated older stuff. You read your 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, or Man's Search for Meaning, or perhaps Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, or maybe a stirring biography from your favourite Christian celebrity. I've read all those 4 books, and they're great, but if you look at verse 5, a wise man, a wise person, will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding, a person of understanding, will acquire wise counsel. So did we see that? Proverbs is for a wise person, an already wise person, presumably an already older, experienced person, to increase in learning. And an understanding person will acquire, get more of. wise counsel. So being shaped by the wisdom of Proverbs is a lifelong process. It's not just a young person's game. And Proverbs is an asset that has lifelong value. It's a great example of why Augustine, the great church father, has said or written, the Bible is shallow enough for a child not to drown, yet deep enough for an elephant to swim in. Yeah? It's for the young and inexperienced. It's for the wise, experienced, and already mature. You won't outgrow Proverbs. The barrier to entry, if you like, for benefiting from Proverbs is so very low. But again, we'll never outgrow them. Does that make sense? Okay. Now verse 7, and we're wrapping up. This prologue shifts. It moves from all the benefits of gaining wisdom from Proverbs to the necessary foundation, the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord, something that we talked a little bit about last week. So fear of the Lord, awe, reverence, treating God like God. What does God himself want this awe and reverence to look like on the ground, so to speak? I'd suggest love and loyalty. Fear of God looks like, to God, love and loyalty. And what does love and loyalty look like to God? In the Old Testament, again, the background of the book of Proverbs, we read that it involves obeying his commands. So check out this excellent passage, great passage from Deuteronomy, well, a passage that I really like, from Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12 to 13. So now Moses addressing the people of Israel on behalf of God. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you as a nation and as individuals, but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you today for your own good, for your own good. So let's get this. The fear of the Lord is not really about literal fear and terror, although in the minority, in some unique times, it may involve elements of that, undoubtedly. But generally, no. It's not just doing the right thing out of guilt or obligation. No, the fear of the Lord begins in relationship, ideally one based in awe and reverence for God, which naturally flows into obeying him. And take note again, we can't forget this. These commands and decrees are for our own good. This collection of proverbs are for our own good. So let's understand this. Here is what is on offer in Proverbs. Practical wisdom, street smarts, avoiding the pitfalls of life, having a moral code that leads to treating other people with love and dignity. And all this comes with knowing, that is, being in a relationship, like a real relationship that is dynamic, back and forth, highs and lows, like light and darks, with a God. And not just any God, not a fake God, and not even like an impersonal force or law of the universe, but an actual being who has revealed himself to us, his people, and who is righteous and just and is willing our good. So, fear of God is steeped in relationship. And we see this ultimately in Jesus. So Jesus says to those who are interested, come follow me. In other words, do life with me, watch me, learn from me, be a disciple, be a follower. That's a relationship right there. That's the start of a relationship. Jesus also then says to his followers, if you love me, you will obey my commands. So there's the obedience part linked to love. And Jesus, after conquering death and demonstrating his love for us by enduring it in the first place, finally says at the end of Matthew, go out into all the world and make disciples, also followers of all peoples. That is, do what you can to help other people follow me, love me, and obey my commands. So a life of wisdom, a life of understanding and living out the wisdom found in the book of Proverbs will be, I'd suggest, a life built on the foundation of following and loving Jesus. And like I said last week, I don't think there is a better deal going. Plenty of voices out there, again, will tout regular mainstream wisdom, and they'll be touted by people who look very respectable and eminent. None of them will love you like Jesus. None of them, chances are, would die for you like Jesus has. Many of them just want to make money out of us. None of them are both human and God. So their wisdom, it's limited at best. It is incomplete. It is insufficient. And none of them are perfect humans, and they will not make you a perfect human. But Jesus was a perfect human and a perfect example of how to be human. Jesus is the wisdom of God, like we said last week, so let's not settle for anything less. So let me close with this plea. Whatever you do, don't be a fool. Fools, as we read there in verse 7, despise wisdom and instruction. In Proverbs, a fool is someone whose immorality can lead to being resistant to wisdom, but get this, and or whose resistance to wisdom can lead to immorality. So they feed off each other, right? They feed off each other. And we've all been there. Either way, again, the big idea is that unlike the naive or simple, fools, scoffers just won't be taught, can't be taught. They've adopted this posture of not having to learn anymore. Instead of having the humility to being open to instruction and discipline, they just scoff. And as a result, they are likely to end up falling into those potholes of life and Proverbs that could save them from that. So to humbly ask, where are you? Where are you this morning? Are you still humbly open to God's wisdom, to following Jesus? Or have you, even in a nice and polite way, decided that there's nothing more to learn here? Are you at risk of being set in your ways? Are you too comfortable? Are you coasting like in the Christian life? Do you think that you've marshaled enough self-awareness over the years that there's no longer any need for any more instruction? I'm only late 40s, believe it or not, but I'm already working out that foolishness is just no respecter of age. Myself and a friend were talking just the other day about how on the outside, in this period of life, in midlife classically, it can appear to both those older than you and younger than you that you're in a time of life where you have it all together, right? You may have good kids, you got a nice house in the suburbs, you got better than mediocre success at your job, you got some nice holidays and memories and experiences all under your belt. But without wisdom, without being open to instruction, without having the greater hope and purpose that comes with following Jesus, it is just so easy to blow all of that up. It can be the long, slow burn of unspoken fear, dissatisfaction, resentment, and alienation that eventually spills over into having an affair, for example. And look, that's happened to us or it's happened to someone that we know. And we'd be foolish to think that anyone is immune from those kind of risks. Foolishness and disaster are only a couple of bad decisions away. Maybe you're past middle age and now in the prime of your life. When was the last time you felt instructed or shaped, if you like, shaped in the discipline sense? And I'm not talking about hardship for no reason. I mean, you actually felt painfully, but justifiably, rightly so, course corrected. If you haven't felt that for a while, mightn't that be a warning sign? Are you still wrestling with wisdom? Are you still trying to live that life that demonstrates God's righteousness, justice, equity, and radical self-sacrificial love that Jesus exemplified? So let's not be fools. Let's not coast. Verse 3, as you'll see probably in your Bible, is often translated receiving. So Proverbs are for receiving instruction and prudent behaviour, etc., etc. But the Hebrew word that's translated receiving is probably more accurately, or could be more accurately rendered as something that's active rather than passive. So it's actually more like taking, actively taking, or grabbing wisdom. Practical wisdom, hard-earned, character-shaping instruction, street smarts, astute decision-making, pothole-avoiding guidance with all the moral guardrails, relevant for both the young and the experienced, all stemming from a loving relationship with the God of the universe, has revealed all of this for our good. Yeah? Let's grab that. Let's go after it. Let's grasp for that. Okay? Let me pray. Father, once again, I just thank you for your revealed wisdom. I thank you that you haven't left us alone, but you've revealed yourself so graciously and lovingly. And I thank you that you really have our best interests at heart. You've designed us, you made us for a purpose. You've given us the ability to find out how our little individual story just slots into the vastly more broader and glorious story of you, and you working all things toward your good ends and eventually bringing heaven and earth together again, Father. And I pray for all of us here, help us not coast, help us not be fools. Help us have that continual posture of being open to learning, even when it's difficult and even when it hurts. But help us, again, just keep on deriving guidance and being shaped by you. Amen.